right, guys, and welcome to Debate Night. So our two debaters tonight is my friend Brad and my friend Taylor. Both have positive positions in this, and then the subject of tonight's debate will be: is the law still applicable to modern day believers? All right, guys. So we agreed initially because both were taking a positive position. We would just flip a coin, and that person would get the opening statement and the last word at closing. That was Brad. Brad, when you are ready, let me know, and I will kick 5 minutes on the timer.
All right. You can go ahead, my friend. So, real quick, just I guess a cursory introduction of myself. My name is Bradley. This is kind of my wheelhouse of study topic. This debate tends to go all over the New Testament, but it really should be limited to the passage of Matthew 5:17 through 19. It tends not to stay too far in that passage. It tends to move on very quickly from that passage and into the epistles. The problem with this is this inherently pits the words of Paul against those of Jesus, and it also elevates the words of Paul above those of Jesus. And I find that to be inherently problematic. Not that I would agree that Paul in any way disagrees with Jesus. I think the words of Paul are fundamentally misunderstood in most cases in Christianity, being that he was a Pharisee. And so if one is approaching his words without understanding exactly what Pharisees believe, one is going to misunderstand what Paul is saying. And Peter affirms this in 2 Peter 3:16, that those without education would not understand the words of Paul. This would indicate that there is a formal form of education, which Peter is referring to, by which one could understand what Paul is saying. But in Matthew 5:17 through 19, or even through 20, you could even extend it that far, Jesus blatantly affirms that he did not come to abolish, to nullify, to destroy, to take out of force, or to make void the Torah. And then he goes on to say that those who teach it and do it will be greatest in the kingdom, while those who do not teach it and do not obey it will be least in the kingdom. This is multifaceted in a way. A lot of people will appeal to the word fulfill, and I'm sure we'll get into that in discussion. But the fact that he says he didn't come to do away with it twice is to emphasize the contrast by which he is contrasting that ideology to what he means by fulfill. In addition to that, he goes on to affirm what he means by fulfill it, by saying that those who do and teach it will be the greatest. And then again, contrasting that against those who don't do it and don't teach it. And so that would be the fundamental point of my position tonight. And that is what I will be defending. And I think there's going to be some great discussion surrounding that. And I will yield the remainder of my time.
All righty, Taylor. When you're ready, I'll click 5 minutes on the time for you.
All right. So my name's Taylor. I'm a supersessionist. I believe Jesus came to fulfill the law, as in complete it, and so forth, like what the Apostle Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 3:15, that Christ was died to be a curse for us, just like the curse of the law, because it is written, a man hanged from a tree, he is a curse. So it gives us this insight that, Paul is confirming not only that Jesus was the Messiah, but that Jesus fulfilled the law. And he goes further to end his draws in both Hebrews, Galatians, Ephesians, Romans, all over the Bible, that it was faith, not works, that led us. No man would be justified in works of the law, right? In several passages in the Bible, we find in Jeremiah, Isaiah, right, that God hated the congregations. He hated their works, right? In Joel, we find a man saying, rend your hearts, not your garments. And people were doing the law, and yet God was not pleased with it, right? David wrote several times, the sacrifice of my lips, right? You do not desire these sacrifices. You desire a broken heart and broken spirit. And that's why with Jesus requires one. Now, when, we got into Matthew 5:17, I guess we'll get into that a little bit more in the rebuttals. But I don't see how, when Peter was talking that these things are hard to understand, he is correct, because that led back to the schism, or something that potential schismatic in the Church of Jerusalem, where they were questioning Paul's authority on his teaching to the Gentiles. But Paul overcame in that argument and continued to teach in these later epistles the same thing he was teaching before, what he was questioned for. So I find it hard to believe that Paul has a different narrative in his preaching, and that we just don't understand it, because that would make all of us, right? We're mistaken for thousands and thousands of years, and there's esoteric wisdom out there of what the Bible actually says. How much time do I got left?
Sorry, phone froze for a second. You have 3 minutes left.
I got 3 minutes. All right, and my main issue with this is not only is this problematic for Christian camps, it's problematic for traditional Jewish camps, right? Rabbi Michael Skoback over at Jews for Jesus is adamant that the Apostle Paul is not only an anti-Semite, but a hater of the law, right? In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 13 through 16, for this reason, we also thank God without ceasing, because when you received the word of God, which you learned from us, you welcomed it not in word of men, but as in truth, the word of God, which also effectively works in you who believe. For you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God, which are in Judea in Jesus Christ. You also suffered the same things of your own countrymen, just as they did from the Judeans, who killed the Lord Jesus, their own prophets, and have persecuted us. And they do not please God, and are contrary to all men, forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles that they may be saved, so as always to fill up the measure of their sins, but wrath has come upon you. And this verse has always been, seen as anti-Semitic rhetoric by the mainstream rabbinical Judaism. They feel that the Apostle Paul is very contrary to what they believe. So I find it hard to believe that there is some esoteric form of Judaism and Sabbatarianism and keeping of the law traditionally, when the traditions are generally diametrically opposed to the Apostle Paul and the New Testament as a whole. And I'll concede the rest of my time there.
All righty. Thank you guys for your opening statements. Bradley, it'll be your first opportunity for the 5-minute rebuttal.
All right. You can go ahead and start my time. So, first and foremost, I feel that Mr. Taylor here might misunderstand my position. The bulk of your statement seems to be surrounding the issue of whether or not the Torah is necessary for salvation. That's not a position that I would take. I certainly don't affirm that position at all. I would actually say that Torah is because of salvation. In other words, after you become saved, you are supposed to produce righteous works, right? That's supposed to be the Spirit working through you. That would be the evidence of the Torah being written on your heart, because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Okay. And even in Deuteronomy 30, we read that this commandment is very near to you, in your heart and in your mouth, that you may do it, because so speech and action have an inherent relation, even biblically speaking. But even with respect to Paul, part of what actually hints us to this misunderstanding that a lot of people take, you mentioned Galatians chapter 3, is the encounter that he has with James in Acts chapter 21, in verse 21, and understand that this is even after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, where Paul is being commanded by James to carry out a sacrifice at the temple to prove his zeal for the law. Not only the law, but James also mentions the customs. This would actually be indicative of the Jewish oral tradition. So it actually goes beyond even the written Torah as to what Paul actually exhibits a support for. And you'll have to answer this in your rebuttal to this. Michael Skoback, is that you said Jews for Jesus, but I think you might have meant Jews for Judaism.
Yeah,
Right. So Jews for Judaism, that is a group that, again, I wouldn't necessarily align myself with 100%. And we can address and have a discussion about some of the intellectual inconsistencies of what they teach. But the idea also that the knowledge required to understand Paul is esoteric is also something I find to be unfounded, because it's out there. It's actually available to learn. It's always been available to learn. And even Peter exhibits that it's available to learn. Again, 2 Peter 3:16, he says this is something that you can learn, but even today in the age of the internet, it's at your fingertips. If you just want to go and take a look at like Sefaria.org, where you have an entire library of Jewish knowledge at your fingertips that will actually expand one's understanding of the writings of the New Testament. To try and approach the New Testament from a 21st Western century perspective, I find to be wholeheartedly
2 minutes
errant,
left.
as Paul was speaking to a first century Eastern minded crowd. So we can't just take the words of Paul and paste over them our 21st century Western perspective. That's a misappropriation and a misallocation of the teachings that Paul has given us. It's not esoteric. It's perfectly available. One just has to be willing to look at it. And I will concede the rest of my time.
All righty. Thank you very much for that rebuttal. Taylor, it is your turn for a 5-minute rebuttal. And then after this, we'll move into the 5-minute of hot questions.
All right. So first, I'd like to take a look at this, that the law is not for salvation. It's because of salvation. I don't really know what that means. If we are saved by faith, like the New Testament chalks out, Jesus chalks out, everybody seems to agree with, what does the law actually do? Is it a vanity, or is it just something we do because Jesus died? We do it to show that we really have faith. I'd like to appeal to the Bible here. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by this law, you are fallen from grace. I have a hard time believing that there's anything nuanced in that. I think he's strictly condemning the law and the people that are trying to do it, right? Because it's all superficial. And that's where, if this was an indication of salvation, when he said you're a debtor to the law now that you've done it, you've been circumcised, you're in complete debt to it, right? That would indicate, well, now, right, I got to get back into grace. I'm fallen from grace. How do I get back? Doesn't make a whole bunch of sense. Next, we'll go into that Matthew. All right, Matthew 5:17, I believe it was. We know this is a very famous passage. Jesus said that he did not come to abolish the law, but to plerosai, to fulfill it. All right. Now, the reason I believe this means to fulfill and not to complete or make it so we could all do it is because of the way this word is found and translated throughout the whole Bible. Fill. Matthew 17, fulfill. Matthew 3:15, to fulfill. Romans 5:13, to fill. Colossians 1:25, for you to fulfill the word of God. All right. If you got your NIV, it'll say to complete. All right. But that's a little bit too much, right? Because it's obviously you fill a cup. Plerosai. It's from a word that means fill. Christ filled the law. And that goes hand in hand with what Paul said about Christ being crucified in the name of the law. When the Lord said in Amos, that he would destroy the Sabbaths and the festivities and the celebration, it goes right into the parable, the way that we would fast and mourn when the bridegroom was gone, right? The Old Testament reveals that, yeah, the Sabbaths and all that's going to be destroyed, right? He hates their congregations. He hates all of that. And that's where we get this fulfill from in this replacement theology. And that's why at the Last Supper you find Jesus saying that I bring a new covenant, all right? Because Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 30 through 33 say that a new covenant will come along one day in those days. Not like the one that came out of Egypt, their fathers did break, but a new covenant that be written on man's hearts. This is the covenant we believe happened through Jesus Christ. And right, as Paul chalked out, this has always been the case through faith. It hasn't been dispensed to us. It wasn't dispensed to Noah and the Noahide. It wasn't dispensed to twos on Horeb. It wasn't dispensed to Christians in faith. It's always been faith. Ever since their faith, right? Like Abraham, for example. Abraham isn't this magnificent guy that parted the Red Sea or went on a boat and survived 40 days and nothing but water. He's just a guy that had faith. And lo and behold, he was promised the great nation that would become Israel. So in Hebrews, not along with Hebrews, but all the Pauline epistles, it suggested faith, not works. And so it doesn't make sense for us to take on works as non-Jews, like Paul was clearly pointing out in his epistles, and just to be all of a sudden justified, or just a vanity or whatever. It's a good liturgy. And I could see the rest of my time there.
All righty. Thank you guys very much. Now, this next section is one of my favorite. Bradley, you will be going first. You get to ask Taylor as many questions as you can in 5 minutes. If you don't feel he's answering a question, you can interrupt and redirect. And then Taylor will get 5 minutes to do the same. Let me know when you're ready.
All right. You can go ahead. So, Taylor, real quick. In the Old Testament, would you say that the law was good?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. So
Not
why
without
did God why did God give it?
God gave the law to men that hardened their hearts. They kept being unrighteous bastards, right? Mainly in Numbers, because that's where you get most of your laws from. And then later you get a new set of laws in Deuteronomy.
Right.
That's
That was part of the covenant that he made with them. Deuteronomy 30 says that he was placing before them blessing and curses, life and death. He would that they chose life, which was indicative of their obedience to the law. So then, in that context, would the law be good or bad?
With faith applied, then the law would be good.
Okay, so with the caveat that faith is applied, then the law would be good. Okay,
Faith.
so you're saying that today, though, in the aftermath of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, that even with the caveat being met of faith being applied, that the obedience of the law is bad.
That's correct. It's
Okay.
a lack of faith.
How do you rationalize how it goes from being good to being bad? How does something that God created as good become bad inherently?
Well, Christ being the ultimate sacrifice, meaning that anything you do now is an insult to that.
How? Like, what effect does Jesus' sacrifice have on whether or not the law is good or bad?
The transmission of sins for the whole world. So that would mean to bring a cow instead, or in saying, look, God, I believe your son died for my sins, but here, I just want to give you a lamb, and 2 lambs or a bullock, or circumcise myself or do works, in addition to that. So maybe I'll be more favorable to you.
So it's a bad thing to want to do things that please the Lord.
Yeah, that doesn't.
Is that essentially what you're saying? So people should actively try not to give in charity.
No, you can give in charity.
What? Well, that's part of the. That's even part of the law. So why would anybody do that?
That's not null and void.
Well, so not all of the law is null and void.
No.
Okay, how do you distinguish which parts of the law are null and void and which aren't? Because God doesn't separate the law into subsects and subgroups.
No, but Jesus dictated the law to be 2 things, right? All right, they're not superficial things. They're metaphysical things. Love. You giving charity to somebody is love. It's love for your neighbor. Right. This is the whole law. 1
John 5:3 actually dictates that love for God is the obedience of the commandments. And then he also goes on to say that it's not too hard. Now, furthermore, is it the job of a believer to avoid sinning? Should we strive not to sin?
We should resist the devil.
Where we can. Right. So we have to resist sin. Now, 1 John 3:4 says that sin is the transgression of the law. So we get a definition of what sin is, and it is the transgression of the law. Now, Paul in Romans 7 actually echoes this. He says that he wouldn't know what sin was. He wouldn't know how to define it if the law didn't tell him what sin was. So again, how is striving not to sin a bad thing?
It's not.
But you just said that obeying the law was a bad thing now.
Yeah, obeying the law is.
Right, but obeying the law is avoiding sin.
Well, it's but
the Torah. Are you arguing that the nature? Are you arguing that the nature of sin has changed?
No, I'm arguing that the nature of laws have changed, and they haven't been nullified.
Well, if the nature of that's what I mean. If the law defines sin. Okay, then if the nature of the law itself changes, then thus does the nature of sin, because the law is what defines sin. So if you're arguing that the nature of sin has changed, I would need an explanation and a biblical citation saying that the nature of sin itself would change.
Well, the nature of sin didn't change. The definition of law changed when you were asking me that question.
Where is the definition of law changed?
We said that, right? You quoted a passage that said to love is to obey the law.
Mm-hmm.
Right, meaning that when I love, right, if I give charity, if I give sanctity, if I have love for the world and love for my God, I'm obeying the law.
No,
No,
that's actually a
that's where this is
reversal of
changed.
that's actually a reversal of how that is interpreted. So first and foremost, Jesus actually wasn't the first one to say that. That actually comes from a rabbi named Hillel. He was asked by a Gentile to teach him the whole Torah, but to teach him very fast because he wanted to learn it very quickly. This is in Talmudic tractate Shabbat 31 Alpha. And
that's time.
Hillel's... Okay, can I finish real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hillel's answer to him very quickly is, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. The rest is commentary, go and study.
Thank you very much. Taylor, 5 minutes on the clock for you to hit your hot questions.
All right, that left on an interesting note. You're saying that Jesus was a practitioner of Hillel?
Absolutely.
All right, what was Jesus' interpretation on marriage in Matthew 19?
So you found the one instance where he doesn't agree with Hillel. That I'll concede that that's literally the only instance where he doesn't necessarily agree with Hillel. However, when asked what are the two greatest commandments, the answer that Jesus gave is the answer that Hillel established. So that's actually a self-identification with the philosophy of Hillel.
So when he was asked if a wife, like the Hillel interpretation says that if a man can put away his wife for any reason, and he quotes Deuteronomy chapter 24 in context,
Right.
and takes more of a thamai leaning, even though it's more extreme than thamais, because he's saying fornication.
Right.
So
right. And like I said,
Hillel,
I'll concede that is the singular only point where he would tend to disagree with Hillel's interpretation. So you could say 99% of his philosophy was that of Hillel, and then the 1% would be that of Shammai.
So where did Jesus quote Hillel?
Whenever he gave the two commandments, he's quoting Hillel. Whenever he quoted the golden rule, he's quoting Hillel. And pretty much every other single one of his teachings. Like you can read through Shabbat 31a, and I would encourage anybody watching also to read through Shabbat 31a in the Talmud, and you will quickly understand which of these two rabbis exhibits a more Jesus-like philosophy.
All right. So how do you interpret Galatians 5?
Which part of it?
Well, 1 through 5 preferably, where it says that I testify to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Christ shall profit you nothing. Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever you are justified by the law, you are fallen from grace.
Right. This is actually an important point concerning Galatians, is understanding the audiences that Paul is speaking to. He's not speaking to Jews by birth at all. He's actually speaking to two groups of Gentiles, one being Gentiles who had converted to Judaism, the other being Gentiles who had not. And you have one group pressuring the others to undergo a legal conversion. This would be the dependence on the flesh that Paul is referring to. One who has converted to Judaism is subject to a Sanhedrin court. Okay, so it is absolutely their responsibility to obey the whole of the law. But further than that, the point that Paul seems to be addressing mostly is that the pressure being put on those who had not converted was that they have to convert to Judaism in order to be saved. This is what Paul is addressing, that no such conversion is necessary for salvation because the Holy Spirit selects from the Gentiles the same way it does of born Jews. And we see this borne out in Acts chapter 10. Even Peter addresses this. But the interesting thing about Acts chapter 10 is that the Gentiles which Peter is speaking to themselves are also Torah observant at this time.
All right. How do you interpret Jesus saying they brought in their garments and adorn gold phylacteries and yet give nothing to the poor?
I would interpret that as Jesus pointing out that appearances are more important to them than the heart of obeying the Torah. This kind of gets into the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. The law pertaining to both of those is the same. It's referring to the Torah, but understanding the heart of the commandment over the letter of the commandment is where the difference is. And that would be a chief difference between both Shammai and Hillel.
Well, in this case, right, the commandment is to love your God with all your heart, meaning they brought in their shawls, they got their phylacteries gold with the words wrapped around their wrists and on their foreheads, right? They're loving their God. Why is Jesus saying they're superseding that with the love part, the neighbors?
Well, if they're not actively loving their neighbor, can you say that they're loving God? Just because they're observing a ceremony and doing the physical acts doesn't mean that they're actually exhibiting love for God. Even the Tanya in Judaism expresses that if you are not obeying a commandment out of a heart of love for God, then that is equal to having not done it. And this is directly correlative to what the angel tells Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, that his prayers are received as sacrifices. The Tanya even goes over that even if one has the desire to fulfill a commandment because of their love for God, but they're incapable of doing so, that it's reckoned as though they had.
So if they're putting emphasis on just loving God and hoping for the best from God and ignoring the latter of their neighbors,
And that's time. But because we're going into the open discussion, if you guys want to start that within that question, that's fine. But I'll put 20 minutes on now. While they're doing the open discussion, guys, for anybody watching, if you throw up some questions for our debaters, we will throw them out at the end before openings or before closing statements or after. All right, you guys may begin.
all right, what did Jesus mean that he was the Lord of the Sabbath?
Did Jesus say he was the Lord of the Sabbath? Or did he say the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath? Because Son of Man is not indicative of a messianic title. You can read all through Ezekiel where the prophet Ezekiel is referred to as the Son of Man. Son of Man just means human being. It's not indicative of a messianic title.
So is Ezekiel the Lord of the Sabbath?
Well, what Jesus is saying is humanity is the Lord of the Sabbath. This is to indicate that the Sabbath itself was not intended to be a burden. It's intended to be a joy. So if in your attempts to observe the Sabbath, you find yourself putting more stress and more burden on yourself in order to make sure that you're following it, then you're doing it wrong. The idea is that it's supposed to be something that is simple to do. It's supposed to be something where you can rest. It's not supposed to be hard for you to proactively observe a commandment to rest. That's it. He's not saying that you're by any means absolved from the Sabbath.
So when his disciples were eating corn on the Sabbath there in that field, and the rabbis came up and said, "Hey, you can't do that," and Jesus went for you didn't say anything about David eating the shewbread, and that the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath.
Right. So it's interesting. You're talking about Matthew chapter 12. And the interesting thing here is this is a particular passage where Jesus actually builds a Talmudic case concerning pikuach nefesh, when one's life is in danger, or protecting one's life. Okay, because eating is considered protecting one's life. So what Jesus does is he draws an attention to levels of jurisdiction whereupon certain aspects of the law supersede others. So he first says, okay, well, the priests in the temple, they violate the Sabbath by keeping the continual burnt offering going, right? Well, this is because the laws of the temple supersede the laws of the Sabbath. In other words, it's more imperative to keep the temple practice going after it's been started. It's a continual burnt offering. You can't call it continual if it stops on the Sabbath. So it's imperative to keep that going. So laws concerning the temple supersede the laws of the Sabbath. And he goes on to illustrate how we read in... what is it? 2 Samuel 21, I believe, 1st or 2nd Samuel chapter 21, where David eats the showbread from the temple, which is unlawful for him to eat. Okay. But this is a situation where he was eating for the sake of protecting his life. Where protecting one's life is to keep one's life active and going, right? Because you can't obey mitzvahs if you're dead. The idea is to keep yourself alive so that you can continue to obey mitzvahs. And so human need and human life would then supersede the laws of the temple, which supersede the laws of the Sabbath. This is actually something that's borne out throughout the Talmud. This is a halakhic ruling even in Judaism. They understand this. So all Jesus really did was redirect their attention to their own Jewish ruling. It was already in play at this point.
So when the lady comes up and throws in her one farthing into the collection, and Jesus said that proportion is greater than all they've given, where do we find that in the Torah?
Where what aspect?
That giving one farthing to be more like to her wealth, proportionate, a better gift,
a larger portion.
Yeah, in proportion to what she gave. She's the old widow gave a farthing, as opposed to all
Right.
that the Pharisees give. Where do we find in the law that this is something that we do? That the proportion of our donation.
It's not something that's necessarily spelled out in the Torah, but it's one can only give what they have. And when you give more of what you have, now I would say this is actually directly correlative to the laws concerning the temple tax and also the tithe, because you are bound by the law to give a tenth. Okay. Anything more than that would be considered tzedakah. It's an offering of love. It's because you love God that you're giving more, and so that's even understood even in the Torah. But there's even that within reason. There are even Talmudic tractates that would bar you from giving to the point where you'll put yourself in financial destitute, because at that point you'll become a burden to someone else. And then what was your offering really worth if the difference is going to be pulled from somewhere else? Now, there are arguments as to whether or not that's still furthering the ability for righteousness, because you would be allowing somebody else the opportunity for tzedakah, charity, which tzedakah, it means charity. It also means righteousness. Those two seem to be interchangeable as far as definitions for that word. But yeah, it's certainly not absent in the Torah. It's just something that would have to be kind of arrived at via either darash or not sod. I definitely wouldn't say sod, but certainly darash.
So we do find an equitable law of tithe, right? Not only tithe, but an equitable. But Jesus, in that case, Jesus is saying the proportion of her donation is greater than all that these other guys.
Right. Why was that?
Well, because of the proportion. Obviously, she gave her only farthing.
Right. It's all that she had. Judaism still recognizes that today. There's an entire portion on in the Tanya actually outlining exactly how that affects, and even in terms of the wideness of the spread. So if you give one person $100, or if you give 100 people $1, you've still given $100, but which one has the greater effect? Well, you can affect one person in a really big way, or you can affect a lot of people in a really small way. So which one is preferable? Which one is better? These are discussions that Judaism actually has. This concept you're discussing is not foreign to the Torah. It is derived from the Torah. I think, though, for the sake of discussion, it would be better actually to return to Matthew 5:17 through 19, because you mentioned the several times that the word plerusai is used throughout the gospel. So especially in Matthew, it is used 16 times. Now, you are correct. A majority of those times it does mean to fill. Because the majority of those times, this would be 13 out of those 16 times, it's in the passive tense. However, there are 3 times it's in the active tense, and Matthew 5:17 is one of those times that plerusai is used in the active tense. This doesn't mean to fill in the sense of completion. This means to fill in the same way that any Jew would understand the word fulfill. When you tell a Jew that they need to be fulfilling the Torah, what they understand that to mean is to be actively doing it, not for a sense of completion, but for a sense of establishment and confirmation. So there's a number of arguments, and Professor Tim Hegg offers some really great ones actually to explain exactly how the word fulfill there is probably much better understood, that he's saying, I didn't come to nullify or to void the Torah. I came to establish the Torah, or to confirm the Torah. It's got nothing to do with doing away, because if he came to say, I didn't come to do away with the Torah, I just came to fulfill it, which would effectively make it null and void and therefore do away with it, well, then he lied, because what he's saying is that I came to do exactly what I just said I didn't come to do. You understand how that's contradictory.
So you're saying that Jesus came to do the Torah?
Absolutely.
Then why did his death include a breaking of the Torah?
How did his death include a breaking of the Torah?
Well, how was he killed?
He was crucified.
He was crucified. Now, how are
Right.
blasphemers killed according to the Torah?
Excuse me?
How are blasphemers killed according to the Torah?
If I remember correctly, stoned.
Stoned to death. All right.
Right.
Instead, the Sanhedrin convicted him of blasphemy and did not bring him out before the congregation.
Right.
Stoned
The
to deliver him up to the Gentiles so he could be made a curse.
Right. The Sanhedrin was not at liberty at this point to actually exact their own death penalty. They depended on the Roman government for that. So the best they could do was rule the death penalty. They could not actually rule the method because the Roman government had to do that.
How were they able to stone James and Stephen and all the other apostles to blasphemy according to the law?
Was that done in Jerusalem?
That was done in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Jesus was also in Jerusalem.
Right. No. I get that. I guess I'm not understanding exactly where you're drawing. You've got to kind of ask yourself why they went to the Roman government for this.
They didn't need to, obviously, with Stephen and other people, but they did Jesus for some reason. They could not find fault.
Are you sure?
Am I sure what?
That they didn't have to go to the Roman government in the other cases?
Yes, actually.
Then why did they go to the Roman government in the case of Jesus?
Because it was the Passover and they wanted to break the law.
Why would they want to break the law on the Passover?
Because they couldn't do it themselves. And Jesus was obviously doing something they didn't like.
Right. So, first of all, it actually wasn't the Passover. This would have been the day before the Passover.
So they could have killed him according to the law. So that
sure, yeah, sure, yeah, and you know what? That may very well be the reason, actually, as to why the other apostles were stoned. I'm fine with that. I don't actually need that. They needed to be in a state of holy sanctity, sure, before coming to the Passover. So they may not have wanted that blood on their hands, which is why they appealed to the Roman government. It's also important fundamentally to understand that this was not a legitimate priesthood at this point. This was a predominantly Sadducean and not of the descendants of Aaron by this point in history. So the priesthood itself was already non-compliant with the Torah in this aspect, but I don't see how the death of Jesus is a violation of Torah on his part.
All right, I'll give you another example.
That's something that would be incumbent on someone else.
Now, when Jesus was brought up with Barabbas, all right, why was Barabbas chosen by the people and not the priest to be the scapegoat?
Whoa. Hold on. Scapegoat? You're going to need to explain that.
Well, that's what the Bible indicates is what happened with Jesus being the perfect sacrifice. That when they presented this, all right, sacrifice, they presented it with the scapegoat, which is Barabbas. So when they instead of asking the priest, they asked the people, who would they rather have set free? And so they choose Barabbas.
I would say you're actually trying to tie a lot together there. That's more so speculative than anything else. If it's understood that Jesus is to be the Passover sacrifice, that's one thing. If it's understood that he's to be a sin offering, that's another thing. The scapegoat doesn't really fit into play here. This is a Roman custom. It was something that Rome had enacted as a means of making peace with the people to release one of their own criminals to them on this particular day. So it's not a unique scenario. This is something that would have happened multiple times throughout history in the Roman rulership.
Well, take the position of Hebrews, the author of that, who's saying that Jesus is the final sacrifice. All right, what do you think
You have diabetes.
he means by, Jesus being a sacrifice without a scapegoat?
Well, I guess I'm not understanding the correlation of Jesus' sacrifice with any of the sacrifices in the Torah. They don't really pertain to one another because the sacrifices of the Torah were never meant to be eternally efficacious. That's pretty well spelled out even in the Torah.
But when a sacrifice is offered for transgressions, Is it not in the law that
What-
2 goats be brought, and one will be made a scapegoat and flee to the woods, while the other?
Which one of the offerings? There are several. This is not something that you would bring with every offering.
The offering in Leviticus chapter 16.
Okay, so Leviticus
For the things
16
of
is
the
not dealing
congregation.
with a sin offering. That's
It's
Leviticus
not.
chapter 4, if I believe,
So
if I'm correct.
Leviticus chapter 16 is not dealing with the sin offering.
Right.
Does it mention a sin offering?
Leviticus, like the book, mentions a sin offering for sure.
Leviticus chapter 16.
That I don't recall off the top of my head. If it does, I'll trust you that it does.
Leviticus chapter 16. Yeah, I'll get it up in a second. You go ahead and ask me a question if you want. I'm gonna go back to it.
I don't want to deviate too far from discussion, but
Yeah, I'm at Leviticus 16, but you can ask me a question and we'll go back to it.
yeah, again, I don't want to deviate too far from
All right.
discussion, but
All right.
Okay, so go ahead.
All right, Leviticus chapter 16. All right, and the Lord spake unto Moses in the death of his 2 sons, the Aaron, that they offered before the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, Speak unto Aaron thy brother, and he came not at all times into the holy place within the veil before the mercy seat, which is upon the ark, that he did die not. For I will appear in the cloud upon the mercy seat. Thus shall Aaron come into the holy place with a young bullock for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat, and shall have the linen breeches upon his flesh, and shall be girded with the linen gird. With the linen mixture shall he be attired. These are the holy garments. Before shall he wash his place, so put them on. And he shall take the congregation, the children of Israel, 2 kids of the goats for a sin offering, and one of a ram for a burnt offering. And Aaron shall offer his bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself, and make an atonement for himself and his house. And he shall take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Sounds familiar. And Aaron shall cast lots upon the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord, and the other lot for the scapegoat. And Aaron shall bring the goat upon which the Lord's lot fell, and offer him for the sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord, to make an atonement with him, and to be let go for a scapegoat into the wilderness.
Sure.
And that's what I'm getting at with Hebrews. The guy, right, the author of Hebrews, I say Paul, but we could just say the author of Hebrews is telling us that Jesus is that sacrifice, the most perfect sacrifice for a sin offering for all, not just the congregation, but the whole world. And
so
we have to indicate that, one, there's no scapegoat.
Right. So my initial problem with this, again, the idea of the scapegoat seems like something that would preach, except that in this case, the scapegoat actually was a guilty person, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of using a goat in general. At least thematically, if we're going to wax thematic and symbolic, then we have to be consistent within that symbolism. But this particular instance in Leviticus chapter 16 is describing a particular event. That's why there's a combination of several different sacrifices rather than just one individual, right? Because the sin offering of Leviticus 4 has absolutely nothing about a scapegoat, because it's literally just for sin. Okay. When we start combining sacrifices, there's actually something very specific at play in most cases, a specific event, or a specific scenario, something that is much more collective than just pertaining to one individual. And so that would be important. And I would even say, and even be willing to concede, that could actually work to your benefit if you read that into your analogy correctly. But again, we would have to apply a level of symbolic consistency with respect to what the scapegoat is. And in this case, the would-be scapegoat would actually be somebody who was like a murderer, as I recall the charge was. Only that, he wasn't actually sent into the wilderness. He was just released back among the people. So there's a number of issues with the idea that this is a symbolic antitype to the type of the scapegoat. But I don't even really have any problem with that, because that still doesn't hit the subject of whether or not Torah is applicable. Okay. So the idea of Torah being because of salvation, you had mentioned having an issue with that. And I could understand the confusion, but James actually makes this pretty clear. Okay, the idea is that once you become a saved person and then the Torah is written on your heart, Jeremiah 31 through 34. Another thing to kind of understand as being important, as you mentioned you were a supersessionist, is that covenant is still only made with Israel. There is nobody else that covenant is made with at that point. But the Torah is then written on your heart, and it's not a different Torah. It's not a revised Torah. It's not a redacted Torah. It's just the Torah, okay, in all of its fullness, then becomes written on the heart. Okay, what this means then is that our actions should reflect that which is on our heart, right? And this is why in the examples even that you gave, where God is rejecting their works, why is he rejecting their works? It's because their heart wasn't involved in it, right? There was no love behind the actions. So actions are fine. You can do nice things for literally anybody, but it's really only worth something when your heart is behind it. I don't want to assume, but are you married?
I have been married.
Okay, so you've been married. You understand what it's like to be in a covenant with someone else where you're supposed to love them. Now, you could do the same acts that you would do for your wife or anybody else, and if your heart is not in it, then it means nothing. But without those actions, there would be no way for you to express to your wife that you love her. Without physical action in general, there's no way for you to express what is internal, either in the heart or mind. It's internal. There's no way for it to become manifested and become a legitimate reality without physical action. And this is why James says that faith without works is dead faith. By the same token, he does say that works without faith are also dead. And I would agree with this. If you're doing the works, but you don't have a love for God behind it, then those works are effectively dead. But it can't be discounted that James says the opposite, that if we don't have those works to demonstrate our love for God, then our faith is essentially dead faith at this point.
What was the old covenant in Jeremiah 31 that they did break?
That would have been the Sinai covenant.
So the new covenant.
So it's interesting. The word berit here is not even new. It actually better translates as renewed, because so if we remember, there were actually two covenants made at Sinai. There was the first initial covenant, right? And they broke that. And then when God goes to renew that same covenant with the same Torah and the same commandments with the same people at this point, but albeit even you could even argue a second generation, he calls it a new covenant, and it's the same word. And he calls it a new covenant, but the covenant itself is not different. It's just renewed. The word there, berit, even pertains to the sharpening of a knife, the renewing of the blade of the knife. It's not a different knife, but you've sharpened it, and you've therefore renewed the blade of it. There's really nothing new about it, except you could arguably say the difference being where the Torah is written, whereas in the first covenant it's written on stone, in the new covenant it's written on the heart. But
Alrighty. I let that go a couple minutes over because you guys were having some good back and forth, and we did cut a few minutes off of the openings. So we have a few questions from the audience. Just got to scroll up.
It's cold. How are you not?
Let me. It says, question for Taylor. And then Bradley, you'll get a chance to respond right after Taylor does as well. You said attention to do the law is an insult. So am I no longer obligated to honor my parents? Or what about idolatry? These are laws after all.
Well, you can't love God or your neighbor doing any of those things. So I don't think we're absolved from those laws. I don't think we were, we don't have to offer kid goats and scapegoats anymore because, like I said, the Pharisees didn't do it. So why shouldn't we?
So I guess in response to that, if we're relegating the word love to being more in intellectual assent in terms, I'll use that to be more vague and broad, then if one makes a graven image unto the Lord, how, for the sake of demonstrating love to that graven image for the Lord, how is that not loving? You
Because
know,
the Lord
why?
hates graven image.
Right. So at some point, even our arbitrary sense of the emotional experience of love is exactly that, arbitrary, and the specific details that God dictates ultimately do matter.
If you
Right.
take a
I mean, that's.
sledgehammer to my TV because you love me, I'm not gonna love you back.
I mean, that's fine. The idea that I'm pitching though is that if we could even say Christmas trees, because there's room for argument that they represent a certain form of idolatry.
Jeremiah chapter 10.
Right. And this is a point where I think you and I would agree, actually. But they're doing it because they love God,
Happy
right?
birthday, God.
Wouldn't you say that they're doing it because they love God?
Yeah, it's a birthday present. That doesn't mean he loves them back.
I
But
am
why
really
is that
enjoying this back and forth,
Well,
guys. But I don't want to turn the questions into a mini debate. But I do appreciate both debaters. I appreciate your spirited back and forth. The second question is from John Lee. It says he has a question for Bradley. How does he interpret John 14:6 when Jesus said, "No one can come to the Father except through me"? Is he talking about the Jews as well as Gentiles?
No one can come to the Father except through me. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would say that could even broadly apply. The devil would be in the details of exactly what that means. See, if we before we comprehend what later chapters in John mean, we really kind of have to start with John 1, which already establishes that Jesus is the living Torah, right? He's the Torah made flesh. So if he's the Torah and he says that no man comes to the Father except through me, I don't see this being problematic.
Taylor, you can put a little bit on the end, or you can
for
say
his
next
question, yeah, I was just gonna be charitable. He's saying that Jesus was the Torah, so that would be what he meant, right, through his interpretation, that Jesus was the Torah, and that's what he was talking about.
Sure.
All righty. Next question is another one by Seamus. Is Taylor trying to say Jesus isn't the completion of the law?
No, I'm saying he is the completion of the law, and that's the.
I think the reason he asked that is because you tried to point out several examples where he violated the law, where in your purview and in your argumentation, you tried to point out where he didn't fulfill the law as a defense.
His
So
death didn't fulfill the law, and that's what ushered in. That's why the temple garment rend, and right, because he was killed.
But you even tried to point out a point where he violated the Sabbath. Like there are several points where I understand why Seamus asked this. There are several points where antinomians typically try and go and say, well, Jesus didn't do the law here and Jesus didn't do the law there and he broke this law. And while albeit there's an explanation for most of those as to why it's not a violation of the Torah, but the problem is you can't say, well, he broke these laws, but then in the next breath say he's the fulfillment of the law. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm not saying he broke the law, like with the corn in the Sabbath. He didn't break it, right? Because it said not to take your sickle and hammer. It didn't say you couldn't pick, right? That's a misinterpretation of the law. That wasn't against the law. And Jesus was saying that it's lawful, right? In the end, he said that I do something that is lawful, and you say nothing about David who ate the shewbread, which was unlawful.
The command is not to harvest in its generality, and in its generality, picking corn could qualify as harvesting, and at this time in the Sanhedrin, clearly that's what they understood harvesting to be. So, yeah.
No, I agree. Jesus lived by every jot and tittle of the law. That was the whole point. He was born with the law. Even him being the son of David, right, and having Joseph be his surrogate father is accordance with the law because he's the next of kin. So everything, every jot and tittle is fulfilled by Jesus. But his death, when he's offered up, when by the Pharisees, and this is where we get, like when I quoted Michael Skoback, their view that this is an anti-Semitic, is what they're saying. They're accusing the Jews of breaking the law, and Jesus was a full Torah Jew.
And I'm going to give Bradley one more response to that, Taylor, just because we've been going back and forth, and then we'll ask the next question.
I don't really have a response to that. I mean, obviously, it's a point where he and I would agree. I would agree. Jesus absolutely fulfilled the whole of the law. I would just disagree in the terms of his death. I find that to be somewhat arbitrary in terms of the grander scheme of things. But yeah, that would be the bulk of my response.
All righty. And then the next question is from the Muslim metaphysician. Question for both. Is it wrong / immoral to circumcise children today?
I would say no.
Yeah, no.
They don't not like, because like if I were to get circumcised, I would say, yeah, don't get circumcised. The Bible's clearly against that. But for a kid, they're not professing believers. It's the same thing as a baptism. They don't know what's going on.
So it really, the question is broader than it allows definition for, because it would depend on how one defines morality. Now, me being as one who would define morality as being what God says, and particularly what God says in the Torah, then I would definitely say no. It's not immoral to circumcise one's child, provided that it's done correctly. I would say it is immoral to circumcise your child before the 8th day, but as long as it's like on the 8th day, you could even do afterwards. But again, the 8th day scientifically would be the most preferable time to perform that circumcision. So then the most moral time for that to be done.
All righty. The next one is addressed to Taylor, but I'll give you a stab at it too, Bradley. It's they want to know if they can marry a relative if there is no law.
There is a law against marrying your relatives, depending on how related you are.
I think it means a biblical law.
Yeah.
But that Jesus did away with that aspect of the law, I think, is the frame of his question.
Oh, can you marry your relatives in accordance with the law?
And that, well, now
that's not loving.
How did he not?
Because that's, again, that doesn't fall into loving your God and loving your neighbor. It's not something superficial.
I mean, I would say it definitely falls into loving one's neighbor, as even your relatives can be considered your neighbors. But that, if we want to go super literal with Western definitions, then that would definitely fly. But what he's illustrating here is this is one of the fundamental problems of trying to argue that the New Testament maintains what Christians call the moral law intact, without the rest of the Torah, is that one can appeal to the laws pertaining to sexual morality, but even that is in its vagueness. Like, what does that even mean? We still have to appeal to the Torah to actually determine what that means, because it doesn't work standalone. It doesn't work in isolation. You can't just use that verse in its own isolation and say, see, this is a valid and objective standard of sexual morality. You absolutely have to refer to the Torah law to understand what's even being spoken about when we see the generic terms of sexual immorality referred to in the New Testament.
God says, hold on. God said that he joined man and woman together, and let not that put asunder. So this is God's plan. So when God gives a law according to his plan, like, you can't marry your father's wife. You can't marry your sister. You can't marry your father's brother's daughter. All right. He's saying that's unholy and it's uncharitable to neighbors.
Eve would have technically been biologically Adam's identical twin, simply female. She would have been the female identical twin of Adam. So if we're going to use the terms of, well, even it's even in the Hebrew when he says bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, he's not just commenting that she's human. He's commenting that she's quite literally the female version of himself. And
that being the case, it doesn't matter because that's God's creation. So the genetics is not scientific.
I do.
She was created out of a rib.
Thank you guys very much. I do appreciate the spirited back and forth. There's another question directed at Taylor, but we will give Bradley a chance to respond. People are very interested in the subject of circumcision. The question is, why does Taylor think it's wrong for an adult to get circumcised today?
Well, one, it takes somebody, like when me, for example, they did that to me when I was a baby, and I always wondered about, hey, there's a little ring scar. Now, for me to think, hey, somebody's going to cut the foreskin off of it, that takes a certain breed of animal to do. Two, it's because the Bible, like the passage I read in Galatians, right, had some harsh words for people getting circumcised. And so there's two factors. I don't see how an adult male would want to do that. Right, me myself, I wouldn't want to do that, even though I already had it happen to me. And what the Bible says about the circumcision, we find circumcision in like 4 different passages in 4 different episodes, and they're not. It's always in a negative connotation. And then Shane or Bradley.
I want to say my response would definitely be that we see circumcision multiple times throughout the Bible in a very positive light, starting really with Abraham, who Abraham would be one of the first ones that we see getting circumcised after the 8th day in his adulthood. So we already have an example as to why it's okay even in adulthood. But even in terms of Galatians, and this is, again, one of the fundamental misunderstandings of the book of Galatians, is when it mentions circumcision, it's not actually even referring to the physical removal of the foreskin in this aspect. It's referring to the full conversion ritual to Orthodox Judaism. In the first century, this was just colloquially referred to as circumcision. Because in the long process of conversion, it would culminate in a physical circumcision, absolutely. But that wasn't the full extent of it. There's much more involved before and even after that, because it also culminated in a mikvah, a baptism, which we, again, still do today. So I see an inherent problem trying to conflate conversion to Judaism with the physical circumcision, which is a commandment of the Torah. The Torah commands the Jews to be circumcised, to circumcise their flesh, but it doesn't command anybody to convert to Judaism, and that I would say is the difference there.
All right, guys, I was going to make that the last question, but there was an interesting one that I think might allow you guys to put a bow on something you addressed in the middle of the debate. And the question for both: who is the Son of Man?
Humanity.
Jesus.
You are the Son of Man. I am the Son of Man. We are all the Son of Man. Because biblically speaking, especially if we want to use the prophets as the kind of to set the tone for what the Son of Man is, they almost never refer to the Messiah as the Son of Man, and almost explicitly always refer to humanity as the Son of Man. Again, I give Ezekiel as the example there. Ezekiel is several times called Son of Man, and he's not acknowledged as a messianic figure. And Ezekiel certainly isn't Jesus or the Messiah. So we kind of have to let the Bible be consistent with itself. If we're going to, say, well, in that example, it means humanity, but in this example specifically, this time it has to mean Messiah. Well, we have to illustrate a basis for that within the Bible itself.
All righty. Thank you guys very much for the questions. Thank you for the spirited back and forth. Taylor, when you're ready, I'm going to kick 5 minutes on the clock for your closing statement.
All right. Well, I believed the Son of Man was betrayed in Gethsemane with a kiss because it came out of his mouth. And then, as we went in, I heard something about Jeremiah chapter 31 being a new covenant. Lo keberet aser kerati et abotam, right? Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers. So I believe the nuance of one word did not clarify that. And I'm still very much a supersessionalist. I do not believe that, people understand the law being abolished. The God of the Bible declared that he would destroy the feasts, the moons, the Sabbaths. He hates their congregations. He hates their practice. But he did not say that he ontologically changed his mind about the laws that he gave at Horeb. all right? All these laws that were abolished and right, what we call replacement theology isn't abolishing the whole of the law. That's what Paul wrote, that we are not against the law. We are perfections of the law. And that's basically what it is because in the giving of the laws, and there's laws, 600 of them, right? They didn't come out on a stone tablet, right? Because the first time they did that, they were broken to pieces. They had to come out again. God got pissed off with the first laws and had to make more and more and more and more. And just like Jesus said in Matthew 29 or Matthew chapter 19, it wasn't for their divorces that God found favorable. Like, oh, I'll just let them get divorced. No, it's because of the stiffness of their hearts. They were going to do it anyway. And God found an acceptable way, all right, and the only way, and it never changed. It was an adulteress. It was a fornicator. It was someone that found unclean, like Deuteronomy chapter 24 states in the law, that if you find an uncleanness in her, it's the same word used in Genesis when they were found themselves naked and were ashamed, right? And that indicates that, yes, there is an excuse for divorce, but it's not an excuse. It is a requirement that they be divorced. So these laws have not changed. Love your God and love your neighbor. That's been the fullness. Now, all the other laws that we come into play with, like scapegoats and moons and Sabbaths and all this is chastisements, right? They're given these Sabbath days, right? And sometimes to duress, where they have to stop farming for a whole year. And if they're faithful, God will provide, right? They have to stop work for a whole year, right? The Jubilee. And the third year, it'll be, you know, there'll be more and more, right? They'll get more than they ask for, but they have to believe. So faith has always been the law, and God's plan has always been the law. Now, God's plan hasn't changed. God's protections and his institution has, because he destroyed the kingdom that he took out of Egypt. Destroyed. The temple destroyed everything. He destroyed the Edomites. He destroyed a lot, right? They did break his covenant. Now, has his, right, in the renewal of the covenant, all right, that's possible. But we're not talking about the one that he made with the fathers they did break, but a new covenant written on man's hearts. And that's where my position is, that replacement is not a complete, just no more law. Let's do whatever the hell we want. We're going with the law of God, God's laws, not the laws applicable to rebellious Israelites. And I can see the rest of my time.
Am I good to go, James?
Taylor, are you still okay?
No, I can
Taylor
see my
froze a
time.
minute. I
You missed me.
apologize. Okay. Thank you very much for your closing statement. Brad, I'm giving you 5 minutes on the clock.
All right. All right. Go ahead and start the clock. A couple of things. So I reject the idea that God ever said that he would destroy the Sabbaths, new moons, or anything like that. And the reason being is that in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 16 through 19 specifically, we see that there will be an institution of the Feast of Tabernacles in the end of days. This chapter in Zechariah is very specifically about the Messianic era, when King Messiah is reigning from Jerusalem, and that the nations of the earth actually will even be held to this standard. In this aspect, that they'll be expected to come to Jerusalem and to bring offerings and sacrifices here in this example even. And if they don't do that, they'll suffer drought and famine. And so I don't see a precedence in the Bible for any indication that the Torah would ever be destroyed by God. Furthermore, the Torah itself dictates that it was part of an eternal covenant, specifically the Sabbath. Actually, the Sabbath is the first initial sign and agreement of the covenant between God and his people, which was to be eternal. So again, if God ever divorced the people and therefore ended that covenant and then ended that practice of Shabbat, that would make God a liar in this aspect. And again, furthermore, in Jeremiah 31 through 34, we see still that the covenant that is made is renewed, because again, it mentions the Torah, and it does say Torah. It's still the same Torah. The difference here being where it's written. But specifically, it's made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. But then later on, we see it's made with the house of Israel. This is indicative of the 10 tribes being brought in by Messiah. This is one of the things that the Messiah is supposed to accomplish, is the ingathering of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. which is why we see a divided kingdom that has this new covenant, but then later on an undivided kingdom that is involved in this covenant. And the Torah itself is inherently tied to this covenant. And in order to find salvation, one must be in this covenant. That's what we see borne out. And so faith is what gets us there. Absolutely. Faith is our acceptance of the adoption. Absolutely. And Paul illustrates this in Romans 7 and Ephesians 2, that the blood of Jesus Christ is what ratifies the adoption, as it were. But once you've been adopted into a family, you are then expected to live by their house rules, and their house rules are the Torah. And so that, again, I would maintain that position. And I think I've defended that position pretty well in this debate. So from that point, I will yield the rest of my time.
All righty. I want to first thank both debaters. I want to thank everybody watching and the people who watch later. Please consider liking the video. It helps me with the YouTube algorithms. If you didn't like the video, thumbs down that as well, because that also helps me with the YouTube algorithms. Also, please consider liking and subscribing. I get yelled at by people after these videos because they say I don't shill my channel enough. So please do so. Also, I'm going to ask our two debaters to give you just a brief synopsis, what they're doing, where you can find their content. We'll go ahead and start with Taylor and then Brad.
All right. Well, I have a channel called Debate the Facts where I satire debates, and not obviously not my own debates, but but other people's debates, mainly philosophers and apologists. And yeah, you can check me out at Debate the Facts.
All righty, Bradley.
I represent one half of a ministry. The other half is my cohort and colleague Seamus. He was unable to be here tonight, and he actually did ask one of the questions in the comments. We are alternate media for now. Alternate spelled ALTARNATE. Kind of a play on words there with the altar and the temple and whatnot. You can find us on TikTok, Alternate Media Brad, spelled very similar to the way you see it here. He is Alternate Media Seamus, spelled the same way except Seamus instead of Brad. We're on YouTube and also on Patreon. So yeah, definitely check us out for some other content pertaining to first century Judaism and the New Testament and whatnot.
All righty, guys, and thanks again, everybody, for watching. This coming week, I have Apostate Prophet. The following week, I have Mr. Paul Copeland, who wrote Is God a Moral Monster?, covering the Old Testament. And then the following week or two, I'll end up with James R. White on, so please join. All right, I'm going to kick the outro, and thanks again, guys.
No problem.